Behind the palace walls, where cameras never reach and protocols are whispered rather than spoken, a 6-year-old prince clutched his security officer's hand with trembling fingers. The words that followed would shatter the composure of a man trained to face any threat. What Prince Louis confessed that autumn evening wasn't about terrorists or kidnapping plots. It was something far more disturbing, something that had been hiding in plain sight within the royal family itself. The truth about Camilla's child would soon break the heart of everyone who heard it. The November 6 rain hammered against the windows of Kensington Palace with an urgency that seemed to mirror the chaos inside. Detective Chief Inspector Marcus Webb stood in the long gallery, his reflection ghostly in the darkened glass, watching droplets race down the window pane like tears. 23 years of Royal Protection Service had taught him to remain calm under any circumstances. He had thrown himself in front of speeding vehicles, wrestled armed intruders to the ground, and maintained his composure through countless security breaches. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for what Prince Louis had just told him. The young prince sat in the corner of the playroom, knees drawn to his chest, his small body still shaking. His older siblings, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, were away at a school function, leaving Louis alone when the incident occurred. Marcus had found him hiding behind the velvet curtains in the music room, tears streaming down his face, his breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. "She's going to hurt me like she hurt the baby," Louis had whispered, his blue eyes wide with terror. "I saw what happened. I wasn't supposed to see, but I did. And now she knows I know." Marcus felt his professional mask cracking as he knelt beside the frightened child. His hands, which had remained steady during armed standoffs and high-speed chases, trembled slightly as he reached out to comfort the prince. Louis flinched at first, then collapsed into the security officer's arms, sobbing with the kind of fear that only comes from genuine trauma. The story Louis told was fragmented, delivered between gasps and tears, but the details were disturbingly specific. He spoke of Camilla's youngest child, a daughter named Ophelia, whom very few people outside the immediate royal circle even knew existed. The child was the result of a relationship Camilla had before her marriage to King Charles, a secret the palace had worked tirelessly to keep buried. Ophelia was now 12 years old, living in a private wing of Clarence House under the guise of being a distant relative staying with the queen consort. Louis described seeing Camilla in one of the private corridors 3 weeks earlier, her face twisted with rage as she gripped Ophelia's arm with frightening force. The girl had apparently spilled tea on an important document, a minor accident that triggered an explosive reaction. What haunted Louis most wasn't just the violence he witnessed, the cold, calculated way Camilla had looked around afterward, ensuring no witnesses remained. She hadn't seen the young prince peering through the partially open door, his small frame hidden in shadow. She squeezed so hard that Ophelia cried, Louis said, his voice barely audible. And then she said, "If you tell anyone, I'll make sure you disappear like your father did." "What does that mean, Marcus?" Where did her father go? Marcus felt his blood run cold. He had heard rumors over the years, whispers among the staff about Camilla's hidden past, about a relationship that ended mysteriously just before she reconnected with Charles. But rumors were just that, unsubstantiated gossip that had no place in his professional duties. This was different. This was a direct testimony from a member of the royal family, a child whose innocence made him perhaps the most credible witness imaginable. The detective's mind raced through protocols. Any allegation involving the royal family required immediate reporting to his superiors. But the chain of command became complicated when the accused was the queen consort herself. Who could he trust? Who would actually investigate rather than bury the claim to protect the monarchy's reputation? As if sensing Marcus's internal struggle, Louis looked up at him with those impossibly young eyes, eyes that had seen too much. "You believe me, don't you?" "Everyone says I have a big imagination, but I'm not making this up. I'm really, really scared." Marcus pulled the boy closer, making a decision that would either save a child's life or end his career. "I believe you, Your Highness, and I promise you I'm going to make sure you're safe, both you and Ophelia." The next morning, Marcus requested an urgent meeting with Catherine, Princess of Wales. She received him in her private sitting room, concern immediately evident on her face. Catherine had always been more approachable than other royals, more willing to acknowledge the humanity of those who served the family. When Marcus explained why he needed to speak with her, her expression shifted from concern to alarm, then to something harder, more determined. "Louis told me he had a nightmare," Catherine said quietly, her hands wrapped around a teacup that had long gone cold. "He didn't want to go to any events at Clarence House. I thought he was just being difficult. You know how children can be. But if what you're telling me is true—" She stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the palace gardens. The morning sun caught her hair, creating a halo effect that seemed almost ironic given the darkness of their conversation. "I've always felt something was off about that situation. Camilla is so protective of that wing of Clarence House. Charles isn't even allowed in without advance notice. We've all been told it's for Ophelia's privacy, to protect her from press attention, but now—" Marcus stepped forward carefully. "Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to conduct a discreet investigation. I have contacts who can look into historical records, missing persons reports from around the time of Ophelia's birth. If there's truth to what Prince Louis heard, if this man actually disappeared, then we're talking about potential murder," Catherine finished, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. "And a child who's been living with her mother's threats for years?" The investigation began that very afternoon. Marcus enlisted the help of two trusted colleagues, former Scotland Yard detectives who now worked in private security. They started with public records, tracing Camilla's movements in the years before she married Charles. What they found was a carefully constructed narrative with convenient gaps. Camilla had been in a relationship with a man named Thomas Ashford, a wealthy businessman with no living family and few close friends. Their relationship ended abruptly in late 2011. Around the time Camilla would have discovered she was pregnant with Ophelia, Thomas's company had been dissolved shortly after, its assets mysteriously transferred to an offshore account that investigators couldn't trace. Thomas himself had never been seen again. The official story, barely documented anywhere, was that he had moved to South America to start fresh. But there were problems with that story. Thomas had been a creature of habit, deeply rooted in British society. His club memberships remained unpaid. His favorite restaurants never heard from him again. His elderly aunt received no Christmas cards or birthday calls. For a man to vanish so completely required either remarkable dedication to starting over or something far more sinister. Marcus's colleague, a data analyst named Sarah Chen, discovered something particularly damning. 2 days before Thomas's last confirmed sighting, he had deposited a large check and written several smaller ones. One of those checks was made out to a family law attorney specializing in paternity cases. The check had never been cashed, the attorney claiming he had never met with any Thomas Ashford. "Either this man got cold feet about establishing paternity rights," Sarah explained during a late-night meeting in Marcus's flat, "or he never got the chance to make that appointment." The evidence was circumstantial. Nothing that would stand up in court, but it painted a disturbing picture. Marcus knew they needed more, something concrete that couldn't be dismissed or covered up. That's when he made the decision to reach out to Ophelia herself. Getting access to the girl proved challenging. Clarence House operated under tight security protocols, and Ophelia's movements were carefully monitored. But Marcus had one advantage. His position gave him legitimate reasons to be in various royal residences. During a routine security sweep, he arranged to be in the corridor near Ophelia's quarters at a time when Camilla was attending a public engagement. Ophelia emerged from her room cautiously, like a prisoner testing the boundaries of her cell. She was a slight girl with dark hair and eyes that held too much knowledge for 12 years old. When she saw Marcus, she froze, clearly debating whether to retreat back into her room. "I'm not here to hurt you," Marcus said gently, keeping his distance. "I'm here because Prince Louis is worried about you. He told me what he saw. The effect was immediate." Ophelia's carefully maintained composure crumbled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He wasn't supposed to see that. She's going to be so angry." "Please don't tell her," he told. "She hurt him too." Marcus felt his heart breaking. "Has she hurt you before?" Ophelia nodded slowly, then grabbed Marcus's arm with surprising strength. "But you have to protect Louis too. She knows he saw. I heard her on the phone last night talking to someone about the little witness who needed to be handled carefully. I think she was talking about him." A terror seized Marcus's chest. If Camilla was already planning something, they were running out of time. He needed to move faster, push harder, consequences be damned. The life of a prince and the well-being of an abused child hung in the balance. That night, Marcus made copies of everything they had discovered and stored them in 3 separate secure locations. He recorded detailed statements from Louis and Ophelia, encrypting the files and sending them to trusted contacts with instructions to release them if anything happened to him. Then he requested an emergency meeting with Prince William. The future king received him at midnight in a secure room at Kensington Palace. William's face was grave as Marcus laid out everything they had discovered, every piece of evidence, every testimony. The prince listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each revelation. When Marcus finished, William was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of both personal anguish and royal duty. "My father loves her. This will destroy him. But if what you're telling me is true, if she's capable of hurting children, of possibly murdering someone to keep her secrets." He stood, pacing the small room. "We need more proof. Enough that even she can't deny it. Can you get it?" Marcus nodded. "I think I can. But I need your authorization to act outside normal protocols." "You have it," William said immediately. "Do whatever is necessary to protect Louis and that poor girl. And if you find proof that Thomas Ashford met with foul play—" He paused, his expression hardening. "Then we'll deal with what comes next." As Marcus left the palace that night, rain beginning to fall once more, he felt the full weight of what he had undertaken. He was investigating the queen consort, a woman with enormous power and resources, protected by centuries of protocol and deference. One wrong move could see him dismissed, discredited, or worse. But when he thought of Louis's terrified eyes and Ophelia's desperate hope, he knew he had no choice. The game was in motion now. There would be no turning back. The following week brought an unseasonable cold snap to London, frost coating the palace windows like nature's own surveillance system. Marcus moved through his duties with mechanical precision, his mind constantly working through the puzzle pieces of Thomas Ashford's disappearance. Every interaction with Camilla required careful performance, maintaining the respectful distance of a security professional while internally cataloging her every movement. Every expression, every carefully chosen word. Catherine had taken the unprecedented step of keeping Louis home from school, citing a mild illness that fooled no one in the inner circle. The boy remained close to his mother, never alone, always within sight of trusted staff. Marcus coordinated with other protection officers, creating an invisible shield around the young prince without making it obvious enough to alert Camilla that something had changed. Sarah Chen worked around the clock, diving deeper into Thomas Ashford's final days. She discovered that he had made several calls to a private investigator in the weeks before his disappearance. The investigator, a retired police officer named Graham Foster, agreed to meet with Marcus at a small cafe in South Kensington. Far from the tourist areas where they might be recognized, Graham was in his 70s now, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug for warmth as much as comfort. His eyes, however, remained sharp, the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime reading people and situations. "I wondered if anyone would ever come asking about Thomas Ashford," he said without preamble. "Thought about going to the police myself back then. But who was going to believe that the future queen consort might be involved in something criminal?" Marcus leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Graham's story painted a picture of a man desperately trying to do the right thing. Thomas had hired him to conduct discreet inquiries into Camilla's background, concerned about her relationship with Prince Charles and whether she had disclosed her pregnancy to him. Thomas wasn't trying to cause trouble, Graham insisted. He simply wanted to understand what he was dealing with before making decisions about custody and his role in his child's life. He was a decent man, Graham said, his voice tinged with regret. Excited about being a father, terrified about the complications with royal involvement. He kept saying he didn't want money or publicity. Just wanted to know his kid would be safe and loved. The investigation had uncovered some troubling details about Camilla's past. Relationships that had ended badly, people who spoke of her ambition and calculating nature. Thomas had become increasingly worried, especially after Camilla refused to discuss anything about the baby's future. shutting down every conversation about shared custody or his parental rights. The last time I spoke to him, Graham continued, his voice dropping, he told me Camilla had invited him to a private property in Scotland. Said they needed to talk away from prying eyes. He was nervous about going, but he thought it might be his only chance to reach some kind of agreement with her. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. When was this? November 15th, 2011. He was supposed to call me when he got back 3 days later. He never called. I tried reaching him for weeks, went to his flat, talked to his colleagues. Everyone said the same thing. He'd decided to leave the country, start fresh. But Thomas wasn't that kind of man. He wouldn't have abandoned his child, not without a fight. Graham pulled out an old envelope from his jacket pocket, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. I kept this. Thought someday it might matter. It's a copy of the last message Thomas sent me, the night before he was supposed to meet with Camilla in Scotland. The message was simple but chilling. If something happens to me, look into the property ownership. She doesn't go anywhere that isn't completely controlled. Make sure someone knows where I've gone. Marcus photographed the message, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Did you look into the property? Graham nodded grimly. Private estate in the Highlands, owned by a shell company that traced back to offshore accounts. The same accounts that Thomas's money ended up in after he disappeared. I couldn't prove anything. Didn't have the resources or authority to investigate properly. But I've carried this with me for 13 years, wondering if I could have done something different, saved him somehow. Armed with this new information, Marcus returned to Sarah with a specific target. They needed to find that property, trace its ownership history, and determine if there was any physical evidence that might have been overlooked. The challenge was conducting such an investigation without alerting anyone connected to Camilla. Sarah worked her magic with property records and satellite imagery. The estate was remote, accessible only by a single narrow road, surrounded by dense forest and steep cliffs. Perfect for privacy, perfect for keeping secrets. The property had been sold 2 years after Thomas's disappearance, purchased by a hotel chain and converted into a luxury retreat. If there had been any evidence of foul play, it might be long gone by now. But Marcus had learned never to underestimate the persistence of the truth. He arranged for a vacation to Scotland, taking accumulated leave time that raised no suspicions. Before leaving, he met once more with Ophelia, this time with Catherine present to provide protection and witness testimony. The girl was more composed now, bolstered by the knowledge that someone was finally listening, finally believing her. She provided details about her mother's behavior patterns. The way Camilla would disappear for days at a time on private retreats, always to places with no staff, no witnesses, no record of her presence. She keeps a box, Ophelia said suddenly, as if remembering something important. It's in her dressing room at Clarence's house, hidden behind a false panel in the wardrobe. I saw her take something from it once, papers that made her cry. She didn't know I was watching. Catherine and Marcus exchanged glances. Physical evidence in Camilla's possession could be the breakthrough they needed. But accessing it would require careful planning and perfect timing. They couldn't risk a failed attempt that would alert Camilla and give her time to destroy evidence. The Scotland. The trip proved enlightening in unexpected ways. The estate had been transformed into a boutique hotel, but the land itself remained largely unchanged. Marcus, posing as a writer researching historical properties, spent days walking the grounds, talking to longtime staff members who had worked there before and after the conversion. An elderly groundskeeper named Malcolm remembered the property from the old days. Strange place it was, he said, leaning on his rake as they surveyed the cliff edge. The woman who owned it through that company, she'd come maybe twice a year, always alone, never wanted any staff around. We'd prep the house and then clear out for the duration of her stay. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Do you remember November 2011? Malcolm's weathered face creased in thought. That was one of her visits. But that time she wasn't alone. A man came, drove up in a fancy car. We were already packed to leave, but I saw him arrive. Seemed nervous, kept looking around like he wasn't sure he should be there. Did you see him leave? The old man shook his head slowly. Never saw him again. But I'll tell you something odd. When we came back to clean after she left, there was a smell in one of the outbuildings. Something chemical-like. And the soil near the old well looked disturbed, freshly turned. I mentioned it to the manager, but he said the lady had been doing some gardening, not to worry about it. Marcus thanked Malcolm and made his way to the outbuilding. It was a stone structure now used for storing equipment. But in 2011, it would have been isolated, far from the main house. He examined the floor carefully, looking for any signs of disturbance or repair. The concrete was old, but had a section that appeared slightly different in color and texture, as if it had been replaced or patched. That night, Marcus made the decision that would either vindicate his investigation or end his career in disgrace. He contacted a private forensic specialist, someone who had worked with police but was now independent, someone whose discretion could be trusted. Dr. Alina Rodriguez arrived 2 days later with ground-penetrating radar equipment, officially conducting a geological survey for the hotel's planned expansion. The scan of the outbuilding revealed an anomaly beneath the newer section of concrete. Something was buried there, something roughly the size and shape of a human body. Elena's face was grim as she showed Marcus the readings. This would require excavation to confirm, and that would need official authorization. We're looking at potential evidence in a serious crime. Marcus stood in that cold Scottish outbuilding, staring at the concrete that might be Thomas Ashford's grave, and felt the weight of impossible choices. Going through official channels meant alerting the entire establishment, giving Camilla time to construct defenses, potentially see evidence destroyed or contaminated. But proceeding without authorization could invalidate any findings, make prosecution impossible even if they proved murder had occurred. His phone rang, shattering the tense silence. It was Catherine, her voice tight with urgency. "Marcus, you need to come back immediately. Louis overheard staff talking about Camilla planning a private tea party with him at Clarence's house next week. He's terrified. He told William he'd rather run away than go." Marcus's blood ran cold. After everything that had been revealed, after Louis had told people what he witnessed, Camilla was maneuvering to get the boy alone in her territory. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Tell Prince William to refuse. Medical reasons, scheduling conflict, anything. "He can't," Catherine said, her voice breaking slightly. "King Charles specifically requested it, said the family needs to show unity, that the children should spend time with their grandmother. William's trying to find a way out, but if he refuses directly, he'll have to explain why. And that means revealing everything before we have proof." Marcus looked down at the concrete floor. At the readings, showing what might be human remains, Thomas Ashford had gone to meet Camilla believing they would talk, believing in the possibility of reasonable resolution. He had never come home. Now Camilla was orchestrating a situation to be alone with another child who knew too much, posed a threat to her carefully constructed life. "I'm coming back tonight," Marcus said, his mind already racing through contingencies. "We need to move faster. Tell Prince William I'm going to need his help with something that might cause a scandal. But it's the only way to keep Louis safe." The flight back to London was turbulent. The small plane bucking through storm clouds that seemed to mirror the tempest ahead. Marcus used the time to finalize his plan. A risky gambit that would either expose the truth or destroy everyone involved in the attempt. Upon landing, he went straight to Kensington Palace, where William, Catherine, and a small group of trusted advisors waited. Marcus laid out what he had discovered in Scotland, the testimony from Graham Foster, the ground-penetrating radar readings. Then, he presented his plan. "We need to access Camilla's private rooms at Clarence's house and find that box Ophelia mentioned. It's our best chance at finding direct evidence before the meeting with Louis, but we can't do it through official channels without alerting her." William stood at the window, his posture rigid with tension. "You're asking me to authorize breaking into the Queen Consort's private chambers. If we're wrong, if we don't find anything, it will look like a conspiracy against my father's wife. The monarchy might not survive the scandal. If we're right," Marcus countered quietly, "and we do nothing, Louis might not survive that tea party. Ophelia has lived in fear for 12 years. Thomas Ashford might be buried under concrete in Scotland. How many more victims before we act?" The room fell silent. Catherine moved to stand beside her husband, her hand finding his. "We protect our children first," she said firmly. "Everything else comes second." William nodded slowly, the decision aging him before their eyes. "What do you need?" The plan came together quickly. Camilla had a public engagement the following afternoon, a hospital visit that would keep her occupied for at least 3 hours. King Charles would be in Scotland on environmental matters. The Clarence House staff would be given the afternoon off for a supposed fumigation, a cover story that would clear the building without raising suspicion. Marcus would enter with a small team, Sarah Chen for her technical expertise, a locksmith who had worked royal security for decades, and surprisingly Princess Anne, who volunteered her assistance with the sharp efficiency that had made her the most respected member of the royal family. "I never trusted her," Anne said bluntly during the planning session. "Always seemed too convenient, the way she wormed her way back into Charles's life. And I've heard Ophelia crying at night when I've stayed at Clarence House. Time someone did something about it." The afternoon of the operation, Marcus felt the familiar pre-action focus settling over him, the heightened awareness that had kept him alive through dangerous situations. The team assembled at a service entrance to Clarence House, dressed in maintenance uniforms, carrying equipment cases that contained their actual tools. The building was eerily quiet, their footsteps echoing on marble floors as they made their way to Camilla's private wing. The dressing room was exactly as Ophelia had described, an enormous space filled with designer clothing and expensive jewelry. The wardrobe in question was antique mahogany, ornately carved, seemingly solid. The locksmith examined the false panel, his practiced fingers finding the hidden catch. It opened with a soft click, revealing a small safe built into the wall. This was the moment of truth. If the safe was empty or contained only personal items, their entire theory collapsed. Anne stood watch at the door while Sarah documented everything with photographs. The locksmith worked on the safe, his tools moving with practiced precision. Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the room's cool temperature. They had perhaps 90 minutes before Camilla's event concluded. Maybe less if something went wrong. The safe opened. Inside the safe lay a treasure trove of secrets that would unravel everything. Marcus reached in carefully, his gloved hands extracting each item while Sarah photographed the original positioning. There were letters, dozens of them, written in Thomas Ashford's handwriting. Love letters, initially full of hope and excitement about their child, then desperate letters, pleading for contact, begging Camilla to reconsider shutting him out of Ophelia's life. But it was the documents beneath the letters that made Marcus's breath catch. Legal papers showing Thomas had filed for paternity rights and shared custody. A threatening letter from an attorney representing Camilla, warning Thomas that pursuing the matter would result in public exposure and scandal that would harm everyone involved. Thomas's handwritten response, stating he didn't care about scandal, it's only about being a father to his daughter. And then, most damning of all, a small journal bound in leather. Marcus opened it carefully, recognizing Camilla's elegant handwriting filling the pages. The entries dated from late 2011, chronicling her growing panic about Thomas's refusal to disappear quietly from her life. She wrote about the impossibility of him being part of her world, how his existence threatened everything she had worked toward with. Charles, November 12th, 2011. He won't listen to reason. Insists on his rights, as if that word has meaning in this situation. Charles must never know. The monarchy would never accept this complication. Thomas has forced my hand. I see no other solution. November 14th, 2011. I've invited him to the Scotland property. He believes we'll finally talk properly, reach some arrangement. Poor fool. Some problems can only be solved permanently. November 18th, 2011. It's done. Malcolm helped me with the concrete, thinking we were repairing the foundation. The well serves its purpose. Thomas Ashford is now just another man who walked away from responsibility. No one will question it. No one will look. I'm free to build my life with Charles, and Ophelia will grow up understanding that her father abandoned her. Perhaps that will make her more grateful for what I provide. The entries continued, describing years of controlling Ophelia through fear and manipulation. of maintaining the perfect public image while privately treating her daughter as an inconvenient secret. There were references to other people who had threatened her carefully constructed world, suggesting Thomas might not have been her only victim. Marcus felt physically ill reading the cold, calculating tone of the entries. This wasn't a crime of passion or self-defense. This was premeditated murder committed to protect ambition and social position. And she had lived with this secret for 13 years, married a king, and become one of the most prominent women in the world. Princess Anne read over his shoulder, her face pale, but her composure intact. We need to get this to the authorities immediately. Charles needs to be informed before this becomes public. Sarah had already created multiple copies of every document, coding them to secure cloud storage and sending encrypted files to trusted contacts. They carefully replaced everything exactly as they found it, leaving no trace of their presence. The safe was closed, the panel secured, the team moving quickly but carefully back through the empty building. They had just reached the service entrance when Sarah's phone buzzed with an alert. Camilla's event ended early. She's on her way back here, 15 minutes out. They scattered, each following pre-planned exit routes. Marcus made it to his car and drove 3 blocks before pulling over, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. They had done it. They had actual evidence, a confession in Camilla's own handwriting. But now came the harder part, figuring out how to use this information without destroying the monarchy itself. An emergency meeting was convened at Windsor Castle, in a secure room that had seen countless historical crises. King Charles arrived by helicopter from Scotland, confused and irritated at being summoned urgently. Prince William stood with Marcus, the journal and documents laid out on a table like evidence at a trial. Charles's face cycled through disbelief, anger, denial, and finally devastating heartbreak as he read his wife's words. He aged a decade in those terrible minutes. The man who had waited a lifetime to be king, now facing the truth about the woman he loved. "This can't be real," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Camilla would never." "She couldn't, Your Majesty," Marcus said gently. "We have the journal in her handwriting. We have ground-penetrating radar evidence of remains in Scotland. We have testimony from your grandson about abuse he witnessed. This is real." Charles sank into a chair, his head in his hands. William stood beside his father, his own face a mask of conflicting emotions. The son who had never fully accepted his father's marriage too, Camilla now had to watch that marriage disintegrate under the weight of monstrous truth. "What about Ophelia?" Charles asked suddenly, looking up. "If this is true, she's been living with a murderer, being abused by her own mother, and over." His voice broke. "I let it happen. I was in the same house and never saw it." Anne stepped forward, her practical nature asserting itself, even in this emotional catastrophe. "We need to secure Ophelia's safety immediately and cancel any plans for Louis to meet with Camilla. Then we need to contact the police, the Attorney General, and prepare for the constitutional crisis this will trigger." The next hours moved with surreal speed. Ophelia was quietly removed from Clarence's house under the pretext of a sudden educational opportunity abroad. In reality, she was taken to a secure location with round-the-clock protection and support from child psychologists. The girl's relief at being removed from her mother's control was heartbreaking to witness. Louis was informed that the tea party was canceled. His visible relief so profound that Catherine held him for a long time, tears streaming down her own face. The little prince had carried such a heavy burden, had shown such courage in speaking up despite his fear. The legal machinery began to turn. The Attorney General reviewed the evidence in the presence of senior law enforcement officials. The journal was authenticated by handwriting experts. The property in Scotland was secured as a crime scene. An excavation was authorized. Within 48 hours, human remains were recovered from beneath the concrete floor. DNA testing rushed through to confirm what everyone already knew. Thomas Ashford had been murdered 13 years ago, and his body hidden at the location where he had gone to meet Camilla. The challenge became how to arrest a queen consort without throwing the country into chaos. Constitutional experts worked through the night, examining precedents that had never been tested in modern times. The decision was finally made that regardless of her title, Camilla was subject to the law, like any citizen. She would be arrested, charged with murder and faced trial in criminal court. The arrest happened at dawn, a team of police officers arriving at Clarence's house with a warrant. Camilla was drinking her morning tea when they entered her sitting room, Marcus accompanying them to ensure proper protocol. She looked up at them, her expression shifting from confusion to calculation to finally cold rage when she saw Marcus. "You," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "That little brat told you. I knew I should have dealt with him when I had the chance." Those words spoken in front of police officers and Marcus's recording device sealed her fate more effectively than any evidence. She had just confessed to planning harm against Prince Louis. Words that would be played in court and confirm her capacity for violence. The formal charge was read: murder of Thomas Ashford. Camilla's response was to laugh, a sound without humor. "Do you really think you can convict a queen consort? Do you understand the forces that will align to protect the monarchy?" But she misunderstood what was happening. The monarchy was protecting itself, but not by covering up her crimes. Instead, the royal family was demonstrating that no one was above the law, that even someone who married a king would face justice for murder. It was a gamble, a decision that could either strengthen the public's faith in the institution or destroy it entirely. The arrest made international headlines within hours. Clarence's house issued a statement expressing shock and cooperation with authorities. King Charles appeared on television, his face drawn and exhausted, speaking briefly about his commitment to truth and justice while requesting privacy for his family during this difficult time. He notably did not defend Camilla or express belief in her innocence. The trial, when it finally began 6 months later, was a media sensation, unlike anything Britain had seen. Every detail was scrutinized, every piece of evidence examined by legal experts and armchair detectives. The prosecution presented the journal, the letters, Malcolm's testimony about the disturbed soil and chemical smell, the forensic evidence from Thomas's remains showing blunt force trauma to the skull. They brought in Ophelia, now 13, and living with foster parents who actually cared for her well-being. Her testimony about years of abuse, about her mother's threats, about the fear that had defined her childhood, brought tears to hardened court observers. She spoke of the father she barely remembered, of the letters she had found that showed he wanted her, that he had loved her before he disappeared. Prince Louis was not required to testify in person due to his age, but his recorded interview was played in court. The sight of a 6-year-old prince describing what he had witnessed, the terror in his young voice, had a profound impact on the jury. Camilla's attorneys tried to discredit the testimony, suggesting the boy had an overactive imagination. But the physical evidence corroborated every claim. Marcus took the stand for 3 days, walking the jury through the investigation. The discovery of each piece of evidence the moment they opened that safe and found the truth. Defense attorneys attacked his methods, questioned his motives, suggested this was a conspiracy against their client. But Marcus stood firm, his testimony unwavering, supported by forensic evidence that couldn't be disputed. The defense strategy was to claim the journal was forged, that Thomas's death was an accident, that Camilla had panicked and made poor decisions but hadn't committed murder. They painted her as a victim of circumstance, a woman trying to protect her child from scandal and public exposure. But the prosecution had one final piece of evidence that destroyed that narrative. Investigators had found Camilla's financial records, showing payments to Malcolm, the groundskeeper. Payments that continued for years after that day in November 2011. When confronted, Malcolm finally broke, admitting that Camilla had paid him to keep silent about what he had helped her do. He thought they were burying construction debris, he claimed. But the ongoing payments and her warnings about never speaking of that day had made him suspicious. His guilt had eaten at him for over a decade. The trial lasted 3 months. The jury deliberated for 5 days, a period during which Britain seemed to hold its collective breath. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous: guilty of murder in the first degree. Camilla showed no emotion as the verdict was read, her face a mask of aristocratic disdain. But when the judge sentenced her to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years, something cracked in her carefully maintained facade. She stood, pointing at Marcus in the courtroom gallery, and screamed, "This is all your fault. You and that brat prince ruined everything. I was going to be queen properly. I was going to have everything I deserved. Security officers restrained her as she continued her tirade, confirming in her rage every terrible thing people now believed about her. She was led from the courtroom still shouting, still blaming everyone but herself for the choices she had made. King Charles did not attend the verdict reading. He was at Windsor Castle, beginning the process of having his marriage annulled on the grounds of fraud and deceit. The man looked broken, aged beyond his years, haunted by the realization that he had shared his life with someone capable of such evil. The constitutional implications were profound. Parliament passed emergency legislation clarifying that while Camilla had briefly held the title of Queen Consort, her criminal conviction retroactively invalidated that status. She was stripped of all royal titles, all privileges, all connection to the family she had schemed so destructively to join. For Prince Louis, the aftermath was complex. He struggled with nightmares, with guilt about causing so much upheaval with the weight of what he had set in motion by speaking up. Catherine and William arranged extensive therapy, brought in child psychologists who specialized in trauma. Slowly, painfully, the little prince began to understand that he wasn't responsible for Camilla's crimes, that he had been brave and had saved lives by telling the truth. Ophelia's recovery was even more challenging. She had lost both parents, one to murder and one to being the murderer. The foster family who took her in were patient and loving, giving her the stability she had never known. She stayed in touch with Prince Louis, the two children forming an unexpected bond through their shared trauma. Charles, seeking to make amends for his blindness, established a trust fund for Ophelia's future and ensured she had every resource available for her healing. Marcus Webb received commendations for his investigation, though he found little satisfaction in the praise. He had done what was necessary, protected children who needed protection, brought a murderer to justice. But the cost had been enormous. A king's marriage destroyed, a monarchy shaken to its foundations, a child without parents, and a little prince carrying scars that would take years to fade. 6 months after the verdict, Marcus received an invitation to a private tea at Kensington Palace. He arrived to find Louis waiting for him in the garden, the boy taller now, his eyes still young but with a depth that came from experiences no child should have. "I wanted to thank you," Louis said formally, the words clearly practiced. Then his composure cracked, and he threw his arms around Marcus's waist, holding tight. "You believed me? No one else wanted to believe me, but you did." Marcus knelt down, looking the prince in the eyes. "You were incredibly brave. You saved yourself. You saved Ophelia, and you probably saved others who would have suffered if she had never been stopped. You should be proud of yourself. Will things ever be normal again?" Louis asked, the question every child in trauma eventually asks. Marcus considered lying, offering false reassurance, but he respected the boy too much. "Things will never be exactly like they were before. But you'll build a new normal, one where you're safe and protected and surrounded by people who love you. And someday, when you're older, you'll understand that what you did mattered more than you can imagine right now." They walked through the garden together, talking about football and video games and all the normal things that royal princes should worry about. Marcus caught Catherine watching from a window, her expression grateful and sad in equal measure. The palace, the family, the entire institution would carry these scars forever. But they had survived. They had chosen truth over convenience, justice over image, and in doing so, perhaps they had earned the right to continue existing in a modern world that increasingly questioned their relevance. The first winter after the trial brought a strange quietness to royal circles, as if the entire establishment was holding its breath, waiting to see if the monarchy would survive the earthquake that had shaken its foundations. Public opinion was divided sharply. Some praised the royal family for not covering up the crime, for allowing justice to proceed even at tremendous personal cost. Others saw the scandal as proof that the entire institution was corrupt and should be abolished. Marcus noticed the change in how people looked at him when they realized who he was. Some saw him as a hero, the man who had refused to let power protect evil. Others viewed him with suspicion, wondering if he had orchestrated the whole thing to bring down the monarchy. He stopped reading the newspapers, stopped watching the endless television debates about what it all meant for Britain's future. Instead, He focused on his work and on checking in with the two children whose courage had made everything possible. Ophelia was making remarkable progress in her new life. Her foster parents, Emma and David Richardson, were a quiet couple who ran a bookshop in Bath and had experience with traumatized children. They gave Ophelia space to heal, never pushing, always available when she needed them. Marcus visited her every month, unofficial check-ins that the Richardsons graciously permitted. On a cold February afternoon, he found Ophelia in the bookshop, curled up in a reading nook with a novel, looking more like a normal teenager than the frightened girl who had lived in fear at Clarence's house. "I've been thinking about my dad," she said without preamble, when she saw Marcus. Not the made-up version she told me about, the man who abandoned me, the real one, from his letters. Marcus sat down across from her, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "He wanted me," Ophelia said, her voice wondering at the concept. "He was excited and scared and didn't know how to handle the royal connection, but he wanted to be my father, and she killed him for it. She killed him because he loved me." Tears streamed down her face, but they were different from the tears of terror Marcus had witnessed before. These were tears of grief, of processing loss, of beginning to understand what had been stolen from her. "I'm angry," she continued. "I'm so angry at her. But I'm also angry at myself for not seeing it sooner, for not fighting back, for being afraid all those years." "You were a child," Marcus said gently. "Children aren't supposed to have to fight back against their parents. That's not your failure. That's hers." Ophelia nodded, wiping her eyes. "Emma and David say the same thing. My therapist too. I'm starting to believe it some days. Other days I still wake up scared, thinking I'm back in that room at Clarence's house." She looked up at Marcus with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "But I'm alive. I'm safe. And Prince Louis is safe? That's because you listened when no one else would. Thank you for that." As spring arrived, bringing new life to the palace gardens, the question of succession occupied political and royal circles. King Charles was 67 and looked older, the stress of recent years having taken a visible toll. There were quiet discussions about whether he should abdicate in favor of William. Allowing a fresh start without the shadow of Camilla's crimes, Charles met with Marcus one afternoon at Windsor Castle, requesting the meeting through official channels in a way that suggested important matters to discuss. They walked through the grounds, protected from press cameras by walls and distance. Just two men processing impossible circumstances. "I've read your complete report," Charles said without preamble. "Every detail of the investigation, every piece of evidence. I've tortured myself wondering how I could have lived with her, shared my life with her. I'd never seen what she was capable of." Marcus remained silent, understanding that sometimes people needed to speak their truth without interruption. "I loved her," Charles continued, his voice cracking. "I waited decades to be with her, fought against public opinion and family objections, and finally achieved the life I thought I wanted. And all along, she was capable of murder. She was abusing a child under my own roof, and I never noticed. What does that say about me?" "It says you're human," Marcus replied carefully. "People who commit terrible acts are often skilled at hiding their true nature, at presenting different faces to different people. You can't blame yourself for not seeing what she worked so hard to conceal." Charles stopped walking, turning to face Marcus directly. "Prince Louis came to you because he knew you would listen, would believe him, would act. He didn't come to me. My own grandson was terrified and didn't feel he could trust me to protect him." The pain in the king's voice was raw and genuine. Marcus understood he was witnessing a man's complete reckoning with his own failures. "He was afraid for you too," Marcus said, "afraid of what the truth would do to you. Children often try to protect the adults they love, even at cost to themselves." They continued walking in silence for a while, the ancient castle walls bearing witness to yet another chapter in the long, complicated story of monarchy and human frailty. "I'm going to abdicate," Charles said finally. "Not immediately, but within the year. William is ready, more ready than I was at his age. And perhaps Britain needs a monarch who isn't connected to this scandal, who can represent a clean break from the past." Marcus nodded, unsurprised by the decision. "What will you do?" "Focus on my environmental work, my charities. Try to make amends where I can. particularly to Ophelia. That child deserves more than a trust fund. She deserves to know that not everyone in her life will fail her. The king paused, then extended his hand to Marcus. Thank you for your service, for your integrity, for caring more about justice than about protecting powerful people. The monarchy may not survive what you uncovered, but if it does survive, it will be because people like you demonstrated that we're still capable of doing the right thing. Marcus shook his hand, moved by the genuine gratitude, despite the complexity of emotions involved. I did what any decent person would do, Your Majesty. I protected children who needed protection. By summer, the plans for abdication were formalized. Charles would step down on the anniversary of his coronation, passing the crown to William in a ceremony that would be smaller and more somber than traditional coronations. It felt appropriate somehow. A monarchy humbled by its own history, acknowledging its failures while trying to chart a better path forward. Louis had returned to school, though with enhanced security and careful monitoring by staff trained to recognize signs of trauma. He was doing better, his parents reported, laughing more, sleeping through the night more consistently. He had started drawing, creating vivid pictures that his therapist said were his way of processing what he had experienced. Some of the drawings showed dark figures being chased away by light, childish representations of good triumphing over evil. On one particular drawing, Louis had depicted a security officer with a badge that said Marcus standing between a small prince and a shadowy woman. At the bottom, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, he had written, "The man who believed me." Catherine showed Marcus the drawing during one of his regular security briefings, her eyes wet with emotion. He talks about you as his hero. Not because you did something flashy or dramatic, but because you listened when he was scared, and you kept your promise to keep him safe. Marcus didn't know what to say to that. He had simply done his job, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. He had gone beyond protocol, taken risks that could have destroyed his career, pursued truth even when it was inconvenient and dangerous. But he had done it because it was right, because children's lives mattered more than politics or public image. The 1-year anniversary of the arrest brought renewed media attention, as journalists rehashed every detail of the case. Camilla, imprisoned in a women's facility, gave an interview that was widely condemned as self-serving and delusional. She continued to maintain that she had been trying to protect her daughter, that Thomas had been dangerous, that everything she did was misunderstood. Prison psychologists who evaluated her diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder and antisocial traits, noting her complete inability to take genuine responsibility for her actions. She was considered a minimal risk for physical violence in prison, but was kept under careful observation due to her manipulative tendencies. Ophelia, now 14, refused to watch the interview or read articles about her mother. She was focused on building her new life, excelling in school, making friends who knew nothing about her past. The Richardsons had legally adopted her, giving her a new surname and a fresh start. She stayed in occasional contact with Prince Louis, the two of them exchanging letters and meeting a few times a year, bound by shared experience but both trying to move forward. Marcus attended the abdication ceremony in December, watching as Charles formally passed the crown to William in a moment that felt both historic and heartbreaking. The new king looked young and serious as he took his oath, very aware of the weight settling on his shoulders. His first act as monarch was to honor those who had served with integrity during the crisis, awarding Marcus and several others medals for their service. Later, at a private reception, King William pulled Marcus aside. "My son trusts you," he said simply. "In a world where my family has learned to be suspicious of everyone's motives, Louis looks at you and sees safety. That's rare and precious." Marcus nodded, accepting the compliment with quiet grace. "I want you to continue as his personal protection officer as long as you're willing," William continued. "I know it's not the most prestigious posting, protecting a young prince who will never be king, but it might be the most important one." "I'd be honored," Marcus replied, meaning it completely. As the years passed, the scandal faded gradually from daily headlines to a historical footnote, a dramatic chapter in the long story of the British monarchy. Louis grew up with the kind of normal childhood that his position allowed, always aware of his unique history, but not defined by it. He became known for his advocacy work with children's charities, particularly those focused on abuse prevention and supporting children in foster care. On his 18th birthday, Louis gave his first major interview to a respected journalist. When asked about the incident that had defined his early childhood, he spoke thoughtfully and without bitterness. "I was lucky," he said. "I was scared, but I had people around me who would listen and act. So many children aren't that lucky. They try to tell adults what's happening, and they're not believed, or they're too afraid to speak up at all. If my experience can help even one child find the courage to speak up, and one adult find the courage to listen and act, then maybe something good can come from something terrible." The journalist asked if he still had nightmares about what he witnessed. Louis considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But I also dream about the people who protected me, who believed me, who made sure I was safe. Marcus Webb taught me that there are good people in the world who will do the right thing even when it's difficult. That's a better lesson than the nightmare." Marcus, watching the interview from his home, felt something in his chest tighten and release. The little boy who had clutched his hand in terror, who had trusted him with an impossible truth, had grown into a thoughtful young man who understood that courage came in many forms. Ophelia graduated from university with honors, studying psychology with a focus on childhood trauma. She wrote her thesis on children of incarcerated parents, drawing on her own experience without explicitly identifying herself. She never visited Camilla in prison, never responded to the occasional letters that arrived despite her requests for no contact. She had built a life based on her own choices and merits, not defined by the violence of her origin story. On the 20th anniversary of Thomas Ashford's murder, a private memorial was held at the Scotland property where he died. The hotel had placed a small plaque at the location, acknowledging the tragedy that had occurred there. Ophelia attended with her adoptive parents, placing flowers and speaking quietly to the father she never got to know. Marcus stood at a respectful distance, giving her space for private grief while remaining available if needed. She turned to him after a long moment, her face peaceful despite the tears. "He would have been proud of you," Marcus said quietly. "For surviving, for thriving, for becoming someone who helps others." "I hope so," Ophelia replied. "I think about him every day, about the life we might have had together. But I've learned that you can honor someone's memory by living well, by being kind, by refusing to let evil win, even when it takes someone you love," as the sun set over the Scottish Highlands, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had begun with a frightened prince's whispered confession. Justice had been served, though the price was high. Children had been saved, though they carried scars. The monarchy had survived, though forever changed by the exposure of darkness within its own walls. He thought about all the other children out there, silent and suffering, waiting for someone to listen, to believe, to act. Louis's courage had saved himself and Ophelia. But how many others remained trapped in situations where no one was paying attention? That night, Marcus started writing. Not a memoir or confession, but a training manual for protection officers and law. Enforcement, about recognizing signs of abuse in high-profile situations, about the importance of listening to children even when their stories seem impossible, about maintaining integrity when powerful people want you to look the other way. The manual would eventually be adopted by multiple police forces and security services, cited in academic papers and taught in training programs. It would save lives, though Marcus would never know how many. Just as Louis would never know how many children found courage in his story. How many adults learned to listen because of his example. On a warm evening in late spring, 5 years after the trial, Marcus received an invitation to Prince Louis's graduation from university. He attended quietly, sitting in the back rather than the VIP section. Content to watch from a distance as the young man received his degree in social work. After the ceremony, Louis found him in the crowd. It's no longer the frightened child, but a confident young man with kind eyes and a warm smile. "You came," Louis said, embracing him without hesitation. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wouldn't have missed it," Marcus replied honestly. Louis pulled back, his expression serious. "I wanted to tell you something I've never said properly. When I was 6 and terrified and everyone thought I was just being dramatic, you believed me. You acted when it would have been easier to dismiss a child's fears. You saved my life, Marcus. You saved Ophelia's life. And you taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned. Ah, what's that? That speaking truth, even when it's frightening, even when it's inconvenient, even when it threatens powerful people, is always worth it. That integrity matters more than position or politics. That one person choosing to do the right thing can change everything. Marcus felt tears stinging his eyes, something that rarely happened. You're the one who spoke up first. You're the brave one. We were both brave, Louis said with a smile. Different kinds of brave, but both necessary. I've built my career on that principle, helping people find their voices and helping others learn to listen. Every person I help, every child I protect through my work. That's partly because of what you taught me was possible. As they stood in the fading daylight, security keeping a respectful distance, Marcus understood that this was what justice looked like in its fullest form. Not just punishment for evil, but healing for victims. Not just exposure of truth, but transformation that ripples outward, creating change that touches lives far beyond the immediate situation. The story that began with a security officer breaking down after a prince's terrible confession had become a story about courage, integrity, and the fundamental importance of believing children when they speak their truth. It was a story about the high cost of seeking justice and the even higher cost of allowing evil to continue unchallenged. Prince Louis went on to become one of the most respected advocates for child welfare in Britain, using his platform to push for legislative changes and increased funding for protective services. Ophelia became a leading trauma therapist, specializing in helping children recover from abuse by parental figures. King William's reign was marked by increased transparency and accountability within royal circles. A direct response to the lessons learned from Camilla's crimes, and Marcus Webb continued his work, training new officers, reviewing security protocols, and always emphasizing the importance of listening when someone speaks up about being afraid. He never sought recognition or fame, content to work behind the scenes, knowing that sometimes the most important heroism is simply choosing to believe a frightened child and having the courage to act on that belief. The royal protector who had broken down after hearing Prince Louis's confession became the man who helped break cycles of silence and protection of the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. His legacy wasn't measured in medals or commendations, though he received many. It was measured in lives saved, in children protected, in the fundamental principle that no one, no matter how powerful or privileged, should be above justice. And somewhere in a prison cell, Camilla aged without grace. Unable to understand why the world didn't see her as the victim she claimed to be, never comprehending that her greatest crime wasn't murder, but the systematic crushing of innocence and the belief that her ambitions justified any cruelty. The truth had won, though the cost was staggering. But as Louis often said in his speeches, truth might be expensive, but lies and silence cost infinitely more. They cost lives, dignity, and the very foundations of a just society. The story of the royal protector and the prince became a reminder that protection means more than physical safety. It means creating environments where people can speak truth without fear, where children are believed when they report harm, where integrity matters more than convenience or reputation. And on quiet nights, when Marcus walked the palace grounds doing routine security checks, he sometimes paused at the spot where a frightened 6-year-old prince had clutched his hand and trusted him with an impossible truth. He remembered that moment, the weight of that trust, the decision to believe and act rather than dismiss and ignore. That decision had changed everything. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. That individuals armed with courage and integrity can stand against evil. Even when that evil wears a crown and lives in palaces, justice might be difficult, uncomfortable, and disruptive, but it remains the only path toward genuine safety and healing. The sun set behind the palace walls, ending another day, beginning another night of vigilance. And somewhere in that vast complex, children slept safely. Protected not just by locks and cameras and security officers, but by the knowledge that if they needed to speak up, someone would listen. That was Marcus Webb's true legacy. Not the medals or the commendations or the training manuals, but the simple, profound promise that children's voices mattered and their safety would always come first. No matter who had to be brought to justice to ensure it,